Good evening. I'm Orge Quarles III. I have been a trustee of the Freedom Forum since 2005, and I'm very proud of all the work we've done over that time to foster First Amendment freedoms for all. Now, I must pause for a moment and say that without a doubt, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Al Newhart and his commitment to diversity back in the late 70s. So I'm a product of his vision of having a diverse newsroom, diverse organizations in radio, television, outdoor. He deserves an awful lot of credit, and I just want to mention that. I'm excited to introduce tonight's discussion about book banning and the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects our rights to read the books we choose to read. So what place do book bans have in public libraries and public schools? Removing books from public consumption is nothing new. The earliest bans in the United States predated the First Amendment. Books of all genres and subject matter have been targets of bans, from Catcher in the Rye and Beloved to the Harry Potter series and The Hate U Give. Last year, we spoke to author Brad Metzer, whose children's books, I Am Rosa Parks and I Am Martin Luther King Jr., were on a list of vetoed resources in a Pennsylvania school district. In our new survey that Jan mentioned earlier, 57% of Americans said that there is no good reason to remove books from public middle or high school classrooms or libraries. We are honored to be joined by Suzanne Nossel, Chief Executive Officer at PEN America, an organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. Suzanne is an expert on free speech and even authored a book on the subject, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. I'll now hand it over to Catalina Camilla, the Freedom Forum's new Free Press Managing Director, who will be moderating tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Orge. And thank you, Suzanne, for joining us this evening. As Orge mentioned, removing books from public consumption is not new. And in fact, it has become a pervasive issue. Last year, PEN America did a groundbreaking report in which you found that more than 1,500 instances of book bans across the country in 26 different states. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you found and what are some of the examples of book banning in different parts of the country?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me at this wonderful occasion. And it's terrific to see the Freedom Forum moving forward and planning out its next chapter. So I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm also really pleased that you decided to put the spotlight on book bans for this conversation. Our report was issued earlier this year in the spring. We called it Banned in the USA. And for us, I've said that when I first came to PEN about 8 years ago, I was surprised to learn that the organization still worked on book bans. I thought, this is so archaic. It's old-fashioned. I hadn't heard about this in years. But we did it kind of with one finger. We would send a few letters a year to a principal or a librarian or a school board when we heard about a ban. And very often, in response to our letter, sometimes letters with partners, that book challenge would be reversed. The book would be put up back on the shelf. And that was that. What we've seen over the last nearly a year is something like in our time that is certainly unprecedented, which is book bans have become a weapon of choice in our culture wars. And this is of a piece with a broad scale of efforts that we see across the country to, as I think of it, sort of try to hold back the tide of demographic and social change that is reshaping our country in many ways as we become a more diverse, more pluralistic country, as a rising generation brings with it new expectations, new norms that has triggered a fierce backlash. And we see that in efforts to roll back voting rights. We see that in efforts to ban curriculum in higher education across the country, something else that we've documented that we call educational gag orders. And we see it in book bans, where particularly books that reflect identities, people of color, LGBTQ stories and narratives, often by authors of color, LGBTQ writers, not always, but it's the reflection of those identities, those experiences, those ways of life that suddenly has come to be viewed as threatening or undermining of tradition, of power structures, of what people see as the norm, what they believe should be instilled in young people as they grow up. And out of that sense of alarm has come this wave of just out and out censorship, which, I think for a lot of us, having grown up in this country, is unfamiliar. It's distressing. It runs counter to our cherished First Amendment. It seems almost like a turning of the back against these fundamental freedoms. And so that's why, for us, we've really become seized with this because, look, there are threats to free expression across the political spectrum. We've done years of work on what's happening on college campuses, what people call cancel culture, cancellation of speakers, trigger warnings, the idea of safe spaces, which we push back against when it implies kind of psychological safety. We don't think that's what the university is about. And we still do all of that work. But what we've recognized is, when you have legislated bans, in particular, which have been introduced in a number of states and state houses, the idea that it's not just even a single school board or a single librarian or a single school, but certain books declared off limits statewide, long lists of books that are being just summarily banned, that if you're going to make a sort of hierarchy of threats to free speech, this action by government, kind of viewpoint and subject matter based, really has to be at the top of the pyramid of our concern.
Now, you mentioned in your remarks the term educational gag order. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean and give us an example of something that we may have seen in the news?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this gets described a couple of different ways. The original sort of frame that people gave it was bans on so-called critical race theory. And I'm sure people have read about that, and critical race theory is a set of ideas that are taught in law schools. It's not really taught in elementary or secondary schools. The other term that gets used sometimes is divisive, so-called divisive concepts. But basically, this grows out of some of the controversy that originated with the New York Times 1619 Project, a major journalistic endeavor to re-examine the history of slavery and how the pervasive effects of slavery on our culture up to the present day, to draw a line between slavery and mass incarceration, a discussion of the role of slavery in the American Revolution. And look, it was an important set of ideas that were put forward. It was criticized. There are historians who are very well respected who have disputed parts of it, I think, quite forcefully and articulately. So, it's a matter of contestation. But what happened in the wake of that was a wave across the country of the introduction of legislation to ban certain kinds of teachings at the high school level in some cases, and very often in higher education. So discussions of slavery, of racial concepts that are seen as divisive. Sometimes it'll be put in terms of ideas of racial superiority or blaming one race, for social conditions or other facets of society, making people feel stigmatized on the basis of their race. And, the problem with it is it's legislative. It's based on subject matter. And as everyone here is a defender of the First Amendment, and that those kinds of viewpoint-based restrictions imposed by government were really at the heart of what the framers of the Constitution were worried about. And these bans are having all sorts of perverse effects where people are afraid, to even have a discussion about the civil rights movement or about the Civil War for fear, and this is the chilling effect that we all know well, for fear that, if you say the wrong thing, if someone asks a tough question, you could be put in the position of violating the law. So I just saw this morning, I think it's in Iowa, a whole course on social justice, and basically, their legislators saying that the teaching of that course is illegal. And so now it's kind of a standoff with the school system about whether they're going to continue to offer that class.
Well, you mentioned the rights that people have under the First Amendment. And of course, we wouldn't disagree that a parent does have a right to petition the government to challenge a book. Talk a little bit about all the stakeholders in this debate and the rights that they have under the First Amendment. Parents, students, the school administrator. How do they differ? And what's the proper way to really challenge a book these days?
Yeah, sure. Look, parents do have rights. And we know that parents' engagement in their kids' education is a leading indicator of success in school. So it's extremely important that parents be involved. We have parent-teacher associations. We have parent-teacher conferences. I think all of us here who are parents know that, if there's something that worries you, that concerns you, that you don't think is appropriate, you raise it, you bring it up, you ask for a meeting, you have a give and take and a dialogue. You don't necessarily go down to the State House and try to get a law passed. And, many of these initiatives really are not coming from the parents or the community at all. They're coming from politicians who have seen that this is a wedge issue, this is a way to get people exercised and energized. And when it comes to book challenges, there is a right way to do it. There are guidelines that the American Library Association has put forward, that the National Council on Censorship Against Censorship has put forward, that talk about putting forward a challenge, and then the school board is to create a committee that is representative of teachers and educators and community members to, first of all, read the book, which is very often not happening in the case of these bans. I mean, people, if it's a list of hundreds of books, tell me that anybody has gone through and read every single one. And then, that committee issues a recommendation. And, there are some, I think we can all agree, there's some things that maybe are not appropriate at every grade level. There are decisions that have to be made about what goes into a curriculum, what goes on the library shelf. There's no way to take judgment and discretion entirely out of that. But I think at least following those processes ensures this is not an ideological crusade. This is not one person trying to impose their morality on a whole community. This is at least something that goes through a kind of due process to determine what the right outcome is.
Well, you mentioned the law. And I know that there was a Supreme Court case that took up the question of book banning, but maybe it was a little vague. Can you talk a little bit about the case and what does the law say?
Yeah, it's a case from the early 80s, Pico versus Island Tree School District. And it's a very divided decision. There's a plurality opinion written by Justice Brennan where he basically says, and it was a case where, in fact, there had been a group of community members who asked for a certain set of books to be removed from the shelves. They were removed. Then they went ahead and they convened a committee. They sort of went through the proper process per the American Library Association. And the committee said most of the books should be put back on the shelves. And that judgment was overridden. And the books were kept off. And it was challenged by a group of students. And they took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And there are some important points that come across in the plurality decision that look, recognizing that there are judgment calls to be made, but that there cannot be a kind of politically, ideologically oriented removal of books, because that is a detriment to students' education, to the open flow of ideas in the classroom, to the right under the First Amendment to access information. But there are dissenting and concurring opinions that kind of take different angles on this. One of the points that comes through that really, I think, is at play in the struggles that we're having with this issue in the present day is sort of, where is the boundary line between a politically, ideologically, viewpoint-based effort to withhold a book and the idea that a community is just, making these decisions based on its idea of what's educationally appropriate. And I think particularly when you get to some of the books about, say, transgender issues, there are going to be people in certain communities that say, look, this is not educationally appropriate for a certain age group. And, part of the challenge is our communities are much more diverse than they used to be. We have all kinds of families living, and represented in schools. We have children. One of the things that's been most poignant in our work on this is to hear from children of color, LGBTQ children, who see themselves in these narratives and who are, for the most part, kind of moving in a white, cisgender, straight world where the stories they're reading are about characters that feel a bit unlike them, where it's hard to relate. They don't see themselves. They feel a constant sense that they're different, they're stigmatized. And so actually having these books can be a real lifeline for them. And there are people who talk about that experience as a child of encountering these books and what it meant to them in the formation of their identity. And so I think that is contested territory. To one person, this might be something that is educationally inappropriate. To somebody else, this could be the way that you begin to see a future for yourself.
But where's the line, though? But where is the line between what is probably an appropriate discussion about curriculum and about the materials used and outright censorship? How do we help people see where that line is? Where does the line move?
It's a good question. One of the things they talk about in the PICO decision is, can you really draw a distinction between the leeway that we would all recognize that librarians and teachers have of, what to stock in a school library? Look, you've got to make choices. You only have a certain amount of shelf space. You're not going to have everything there. And so those decisions are made all the time. But and this is part of Justice Brennan's opinion, something that, where I agree with him is saying that when it comes to withdrawing a book, look, there's a normal process by which those shelves get filled and people are exercising their professional judgment to decide what goes on. When you're picking out a single book and saying, this is no good, what that essentially does is it says someone is in a position to override that judgment. And why are they overriding that judgment? I think we all agree. We may not all agree on exactly what constitutes obscenity, but there's pretty broad agreement that obscenity is on one side of the line, and that those are, if it was a question of something pornographic in a school library, we'd all say, that probably doesn't belong there. And then you get into these complex gradations where, something like Lolita, this is not entirely new. And if that book was revisited anew now, I think there'd be, all sorts of arguments about it. You talked about your work on Me Too. There's all sorts of narratives that might be seen as dangerous or undermining in different ways. Our position at PEN America is that on balance, we ought to construe the leeway very broadly. We're just better off deferring to the professional judgment of people who do this for a living, letting their decisions stand, not having politicians, wing in to sort of pick and choose and bring their own ideological predilections. And you see, to us, it's an equality issue. When the books that are being targeted, so consistently reflect particular identities that we already know are stigmatized and marginalized and targeted in other ways in society.
So I want to get into a discussion a little bit about engagement. We at the Freedom Forum, we're trying to reach people where they're at about the First Amendment. How do you have a constructive dialogue with someone who may not have the same view as you do about book banning? And how do you reach, say, the parent in Deep Red, Texas, or the Fortune 500 CEO in New York who may think, that really doesn't affect me?
Yeah, look, one of the things I think is important is to acknowledge, some of the root cause of this and to try to reflect the fact that people feel a sense of anxiety, that they feel threatened, they're worried about, how quickly things seem to be moving in society. And you can have some empathy for that. And I think that is a good starting point. I think the other piece, and this was cited in your introduction, is most people don't like censorship. There is, I think, a very deeply ingrained American fealty to the First Amendment. I think it's waned. I think it's great you're getting out there to amusement parks and campuses to try to rekindle that. And we're doing that work too. And I think it's extremely important with young people to instill in them a sense of why these freedoms are so fundamental. But, most Americans still almost reflexively do believe in free speech. They do believe in the First Amendment. And so when you explain why it is and how it is that, even in the name of fending off that something that they find to be, very menacing or unsettling, that the resort to censorship is un-American, that it goes against the Constitution, and that it's a cure that's worse than the problem. I think is a powerful argument. I also think trying to foster civilized give and take and dialogue about some of these issues. And there is some sense in some communities that you're sort of shut down if you raise any questions about, whether it's something like affirmative action, which it's controversial. We ought to be able to talk about it. And so I think being willing to and making the effort to convene discussions on some of these contested topics so that people feel like, look, there's at least a space for the conversation, and you don't have to resort to trying to get a legislative ban in place to advance your view or defend against someone else's.
As we wrap up, I read something that you wrote in which you made a comment about the role that philanthropic organizations play. What is their space here? And if you could touch a little bit on a topic that I heard you discuss earlier in the conversation about other rights and that might be at play and that might be challenged by all this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in terms of philanthropy, what's interesting is, look, this is a pretty new fight. And so it's not like you have a lot of well-established organizations or funds that are doing this work. Even kind of the nexus of free speech and education, which is an arena that we've been working in for probably about 6 years. We started with the work on campus free speech, and it's expanded. That's new. And we've seen this year, really for the first time, a few education funders that we had been in discussions with for a long time suddenly are making the link between their concerns about equity in education and, this wave of repressiveness, and recognizing that, if all those books are whisked away from the shelves, that undermines equity in education. People are not getting a fair shake. Their chances of being successful academically are undercut. And so that is kind of a nascent set of connections I think that philanthropy is beginning to make. The other piece I observe is that there's a lot of I think well-taken angst over the fate of our democracy and all that menaces it. But book bans and educational gag orders are not really seen as part of that agenda. It's very much focused on sort of voting rights and what's happening at the ballot box. And what I observe is that this broadside on our democracy is a lot broader than that. And the work that we need to do to stitch people together and elevate the values that can unite us, including the First Amendment. I always have believed it's a cause above politics. I know people on the right pride themselves. I remember at the Republican convention just 2 years ago, the party proudly declaring itself the standard bearer for free speech. And so, bringing that up, reminding that this is part of our shared commitment to democracy, that this has to be defended, that, this is of a piece of how, in terms of how we bring forward a pluralistic society where we can live together as people, amidst our diversity and have ways of resolving our problems that don't involve a betrayal of our constitutional principles.
Suzanne, I think that's a really great way to end our discussion. And I know we could have a conversation about this all night. I want to thank you for your time and your insight, and I'm going to throw the program back to Jan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne and Catalina, for such a thought-provoking conversation. We could sit here all night and listen to this. It was really fascinating. So much more to talk about. And it's a terrific example of the conversations we hope to engage in across the country as we meet people where they are, and we inspire them to know, understand, value, and defend the freedoms of the First Amendment. We hope this evening has inspired all of you to think more about book bans and to engage about this issue with your own community in your public libraries and in schools. I thank you so much for being here to celebrate with us tonight. Have a good evening.